Back to Free Speech Nation with me, Andrew Doyle. The Republic of Ireland recently passed its contentious hate crime bill, positioned as a measure to protect vulnerable groups. Proponents argue that the bill is a necessary step towards ensuring the safety of marginalised individuals. However, the bill's critics argue that it risks introducing children to potentially harmful gender identity ideology and also, of course, infringes on free speech. Well, I'm joined now by the founder and barrister, the founder of the Countess and women's rights activist, Leisha de Bruin. Welcome to the show. Leisha, thanks for coming all this way. So let's start with the necessity for these discussions. We've had lots of discussions on this show about the hate speech element of the hate crime bill. Hate crime bill is now passed not with those elements. But all of this, the most pressing concern is really women's rights, isn't it? And there's a case that's recently been troubling you. Do you want to tell us about this?
Yes, Barbie Kardashian was acquitted last Friday in a case in Limerick. It was the first time that the policy of mixing men and women, that is, allowing men who identify as women into female-only prisons, that was sort of tested in court. He faced charges of threatening, threats to not only a female prisoner, but also a female prison guard.
Yes.
And in fact he was acquitted on all charges. But unusually in this case he took the box, which is very rare, and he actually gave his own evidence, and he said quite clearly that he had made the threats. He did intend that he'd made the threats. He in fact even corrected counsel for the prosecution. He said, no, I said I would rape them, not with a implement, with an object. It was graphic, it was horrific, it was really a harrowing 4 days of evidence. And
this is all on record? This was said in the court? Yes,
this was all said in open court. Yeah. So he admitted to making the threats, but really the ingredients of defence, the prosecution, it seemed, did not prove all the ingredients, because one ingredient of the offence is the intent. So they had to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he intended to carry through.
So we have this testimony from the horse's mouth, as it were, in the court. On the other hand, the jury found Barbie Kardashian not guilty. Yeah. However, this raises a broader question, doesn't it? Because Barbie Kardashian was put in a female prison in the female estate. And can you give us some background? Because this is not a pleasant individual, right? This is a violent individual.
No, Barbie Kardashian was already, had been tried and had been found guilty of threats to rape and murder his own mother. So he was in custody already on the women's wing of Limerick prison when this incident took place. So really it was the first time that was sort of discussed in open court, and that policy of allowing men who identify as women into female prison to be placed there was sort of outed really in Ireland.
Well, why does someone like that end up in... What's the justification for someone like that who's delivered those kind of threats to his own mother? What's the justification for putting that person in a female prison?
Well, in Ireland since 2015 we have the Gender Recognition Act, so we have full self-ID, and full self-ID means there is no gatekeeping. By definition there's no gatekeeping, and in fact a very dangerous, undoubtedly very disturbed but highly dangerous man like Barbie Kardashian can fill out a form and he will be given a gender recognition certificate, and that allows him then to be placed in a female prison, and that's what's happening in Ireland. That is the current policy. So I would view the gender recognition certificate and self-ID as really an access all area pass for predators, for perverts, for sports cheats, for transgressors, for fetishists. And I see that the effects of self-ID are felt most viscerally really in prisons, because these women obviously are often quite dehumanised, and they are the most vulnerable really in our society.
I mean, that's the question, isn't it? A lot of people just don't care about prisoners, I think it would be fair to say. So when you say, well, there's men in women's prison, they all say, well, those are just criminals, why should I care? I mean, is that a fair observation?
I think that's very fair, and I even had a very senior politician, when I was chatting with them about this, say, well, do you think they really mind? That is the level of dehumanisation and othering of that population of female prisoners.
But Ireland continually has referenda regarding various issues, but the self-ID, there was no real public consultation about this, was there? It's as though the major parties just arbitrarily pushed it through.
Yes, I think it was snuck in under the radar, and I do feel it was part of kind of a broader wave of progressivism and a sort of sense of ourselves as a new... we're sort of shaking off our old Catholic past and stepping, brightly into this new future. And so we had passed other progressive legislation, and this seemed to be the next new frontier, but it wasn't really explained ever. There was nobody in the room explaining how this would impact single-sex spaces, child safeguarding, the rights of same-sex attracted people, single-sex sports, and of course prisons. And really, by placing men who identify as women in female prison, we're undoing a 200-year reform that was brought in by penal reformers like Elizabeth Fry. And the same reason exists now as did then for separating the sexes when it comes to prison. It's very obvious that women are vulnerable to sexual assault if they're in with men. And in this case, a prison officer was also threatened by Barbie Kardashian. And we have always said and argued that female prison staff and in prisons where there were men, their human rights are also being breached. And in this case, he admitted to threatening that prison officer. And she said in her evidence that her whole life long in her career, she'd never feared a prisoner. But in this case, she was scared of that prisoner.
Now, let's talk about the hate crime bill, because, of course, a lot of women's rights campaigners have been concerned about this bill, which has been going on for a while now. And originally there was a hate speech element there where they could have seized your phone or any device if they suspected that you had material likely to stir up hatred. A lot of the suspicion was that this was going to be weaponised against people who believe that you cannot change sex, which actually is a fact. And that this was going to particularly affect gender-critical individuals. Yeah,
I think that's the concern, that by choosing certain groups of people who have certain special characteristics and affording them special protection, that essentially it creates a new legislative framework, which is not equality before the law, but it also can lead to the criminalisation, or at least the chilling impact on very ordinary opinions, majority-led opinions, felt opinions around sex and gender.
So what's the development now with the hate crime bill? Where it's passed now, but in a different form.
Well, they have dropped the incitement piece, and I think they said there was no consensus. I think it was too much of a hot potato. There wasn't enough backing for it. But unfortunately, it has passed, and my big concern with it is that we're moving to a new legislative framework whereby special groups will have special rights and protections, but also beyond that, they're managing to import a totally new, novel definition of gender. And people are saying, oh, this is nonsensical, it's meaningless, because it's sort of a trans definition of gender. But it's more important than that, because if you change what gender means in law, it impacts everything. It impacts equality legislation. And the gender ground in equality legislation is what allows service providers to lawfully provide single-sex toilets, single-sex changing rooms. And if you collapse the meaning of gender beyond if someone is male or female and make it gender orientation or a trans ideology, a trans identity, then at any moment, any man on a whim can just identify into that space, and those protections are lost to women and for child safeguarding.
Do you believe that if the incitement element of the bill comes back in another form, as many people think it will, that will be weaponised against people who, say, misgender individuals or express their concerns about some of the issues you've been raising?
I mean, absolutely. I think that's absolutely how it will play out. But I also think we need to see it in the context of a broader, bigger, more meta structure of censorship that's coming from Europe, like the Digital Services Act, whereby tech companies will have to censor certain content. So I think it's only one piece in a kind of an infrastructure and architecture that we have to always be mindful of.
Yes, and it's particularly a problem in Ireland at the moment. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, but tell us finally where people can find out more about the work that you're doing.
So I founded an organisation called the Countess, and we are inspired by Countess Markievicz. She was the first ever Minister of State in a modern democracy. And so we are on all the different social media platforms. We've got a website, we're on YouTube, we're everywhere. So you'll find us, it's thecountess.ie.